So, if you happen to frequent our awards videos, believe it or not, this one was not suggested to me by Ashley. And I just happened to... I knew something had to go with Leon. It was another one of those cases where I had just thought about it for a while, like just Hitman movies in general, like Collateral came to mind, because I really want to talk about Collateral at some point too. But then it just occurred to me, why not go with the other young girl being trained to be an assassin movie. It seems obvious now. And speaking of the award stuff, completely unintentional and something I only realized after the fact, to pit Gary Oldman with against his Darkest Hour director, so that's purely coincidence. So I guess since Leon's the one that I wanted to talk about in the first place, we'll start with that, especially since I had just talked about The Fifth Element a few weeks ago. So, to begin with, this clearly was right off the heels of when he made La Femme Nikita a couple of years prior. So much so that a lot of people thought maybe they were a little too close, but I believe Besson actually made the comment that Leon could very well be a kind of distant relative or cousin or something to his character in La Femme Nikita, Jean Reno's character in La Femme Nikita. So it does kind of just flow right into it and kind of gives us this sort of not quite. There's a bit of a kind of reverse angle to it, where we do have the girl that's being trained, even though she's clearly much younger in this, but it's also, there was the whole taking a character and making them civilized thing, and that's kind of somewhat, they're kind of having that reverse impact where Matilda is starting off normal, and then eventually attempting to become a killer, whereas she's also starting to humanize Leon as a character when he starts off as a killer. So yeah, but it's all very close in the same world as Besson's movies tend to be. Like, these feel like they're all kind of in their same little crime world, whereas his sci-fi movies like The Fifth Element and Valerian all feel like they're in the same world. So he does have something going on here, even if his movies are often hit and miss. But you pretty much ask anybody, Leon shows that when they do hit, sometimes they can hit huge. So starting off here, it is kind of the cliche where we kind of add a bit of Jesus Christ, sophistication to our characters through their interests. For instance, not only is Leon just this contract killer, but he also does these mundane things like takes care of his plants, but then he also goes to the movie theater and loves to sit really up close to Gene Kelly movies, even if nobody else around him is either there or all that present when they are there. So it might as well just be one show for him, which he's perfectly happy with. It's like the one circumstance in the movie prior to him meeting Matilda that he does seem happy. And even when he does meet Matilda, it takes him a little while to find that again. And sure enough, when she imitates Gene Kelly, it seems to be when that starts. So there's definitely something there with that as well. And talking about, okay, I guess before we go into the rest, it's worth noting Besson's direction itself is really kind of the star of the movie apart from the performances. Where we do have some really good action scenes here, and the characters themselves, kind of the way they interact and the way we kind of build on this, there's some of it is really well done, some of it kind of seems either rushed or kind of just not really up to par with the other aspects of the movie. Like, for instance, some of the dialogue at the beginning, kind of like we have the whole the serious thing, where it's a serious guy or whatever, that feels kind of like a clunky start, and then that's followed almost immediately by the cliche line, "We've got company," not once, but twice in a row. And this is all at the very beginning, so you kind of start off thinking, is this going to be just another movie like that? Just some throwaway action movie, even if La Femme Nikita felt like it was something a bit unique. At the time it came out, it was. And certainly had its own unique style, which, like I said, talking about The Fifth Element, regardless of what genre he's in, it's like, whenever you see a Luc Besson movie, it's like, even if his name is just vaguely on it, like 3 Days to Kill, where he wrote it but didn't direct it, it's like, that's still a Luc Besson movie all day, every day, and you can tell just by looking at it, even though it wasn't even him that directed it. And so yeah, stuff like that, like this whole opening when we go through the streets and all that, and then up to the restaurant, and then the way the action is depicted most of the time, like I said, really, really makes it rise above. And once the first action scene kind of happens, and you see that interaction with him when they're on the phone and all that, and he's got the knife to the guy's throat, it's like, then you start to realize, okay, maybe we'll just forget about cheesy dialogue and all that, and realize that there's still something really cool going on here regardless. And sure enough, once we get there, even the dialogue starts to pick itself up. It's still obviously going to be a little bit cheesy, but that's really not much of the importance of this movie. Going on, when you think about a movie like this where you set up these particular criticisms, where it ultimately does end up bettering itself, one of the things that you may not suspect going in at all was, as I just mentioned, the performances. Obviously, Jean Reno is doing something really great here. This is like the defining role for him, and we've seen him around, like I said, in other Besson movies like The Big Blue and La Femme Nikita, but then there's stuff like Ronin. Then he eventually, somehow, someway, ended up in the Pink Panther movies with Steve Martin. Random movies like Wasabi. It's just so this is definitely a defining role for him, and I'm kind of really surprised that we don't, even though there's obviously something, foreign to him that may or may not put off American audiences. I don't know how they typically kind of group think in regards to studios hiring and all that other stuff, but you would think that this would have made something like really gigantic out of him in regards to leading movies, but that didn't seem to happen. That could also be a case of him not being interested in that sort of thing. I've never really looked into it, but this is definitely, yeah, it's one of those cases where you just can't even imagine anybody else. So, but then we go on to, we'll actually go on to Natalie Portman next. I'll wait for Oldman for a second. The amazing thing about Portman here is that it's a little hard to believe that it is her first movie, I believe, because there is, I mean, God, what a way to come into the movie world. And it's like even though I'm not Black Swan's biggest fan at all, it's like, it's just not surprising at all to watch this and to know that this would go on to become an Oscar-winning actress. Just very much so. And there is, because there's so much that she has to do to show off. There's, I know there's a lot of comparisons to Jodie Foster and Taxi Driver, but I think this is, immensely more complex than that, even. Not to, say anything bad about Jodie Foster and Taxi Driver at all, but, I feel like this is a lot more of a complex role, and something that's much more, that stands out a lot more, which is, she's obviously going to be, because the thing about Foster was that she always kind of had that, there wasn't anything particularly childlike about her. Like, the only way that really, came to the foreground was De Niro constantly saying, "You're a child," but she did not act like it at all, whereas Portman here does very much come off like a child in this environment, despite the fact that she's got so much inner rage and such a bloodlust that's really weird to see in a, I think Matilda's supposed to be 12. I think Portman was at least a couple of years older when they actually shot it, but she's supposed to be 12, I think. So, bearing that in mind, I mean, there's more to her age that I'll get into towards the end, but in the meantime, there's still just so much that she has to do here, but then there's stuff like not just the rage, but there's also this, even being as young as she is, seeming like she's at the end of her rope after what she's already been through. It's like she doesn't even care that her family's dead. It's strictly the little brother that has driven her to this point. And it's that moment when she wants to play the game, when she puts the gun to her head, and it's like you look at her face and you look into her eyes, and it's like, in this very young girl, there is this vacancy in her eyes that basically says, I regardless of the circumstances, whatever should happen, I am ready to die in this moment. And it's just imagining an actress this young, too, going to a place like that. Like, sure, actors and actresses would go to those places very often, but this is a 13 or 14-year-old girl in her first movie. And she managed to flawlessly get to that place for this particular scene, and it's something that really stays with you, too. But then, like I was saying, there's other scenes, like, the way they mix up the childlike naivete over with the advances that she makes towards Leon, which, it's, performance-wise, it really shows off an interesting range to what all emotions she brings to this character, and sometimes they weirdly kind of come together, like in just one particular moment, when they're going around and they're putting gum in the holes in the doors, and he's put his gum there that he chewed out of his mouth in there, and so when she goes inside, she takes the gum out that was in his mouth and puts it in hers. And she has this look on her face when she does that. And this look could mean two things. I mean, much as we don't want to go there, the movie already has taken us there. This could be her sort of getting off on the idea of having it in her mouth after it was in his. But the face also kind of stems, like, we've just seen Leon go through this door with a gun in his hand ready to kill this dude. And the face also kind of reads as that kind of childlike, oh, somebody's in trouble look that you just would if you saw, like, a teacher scolding somebody on a playground. You would make that same face. So you could read either one, given how the movie has set her up at this point. And the fact that she was able to pull that off, whether that was the intention or not, speaks volumes about her talent here. And just the character in general, how she's able to be, and some people, I could probably see some criticisms that this makes the movie implausible or unrealistic or something. If you're worried about implausibility and not being realistic, you've probably never seen a Luc Besson movie. But, so, what happens here is, she is very smart about what she does, much like Leon is. But it's not just her training, like, there's something that seems to be inherently there in her. And there are so many times in this movie where, particularly like the knocking scene, where she tricks them into saying, you know, this was our secret knock, and then obviously it's not, to where you just want to, like, cheer her on and say, yes, that is so smart of you. I love that you were able to get yourself out of this in such a clever way so quickly. And there's plenty of those where she becomes just as much of the, like, we're rooting for her even more than we're rooting for Leon, even though we've known him longer in the movie. And he's supposedly our main protagonist, depending on what side you're on, I guess. But speaking of which side we are and are not on, we have to now talk about our villain, Stansfield. So, there's, I mean, I'm not even sure where to start with this. Obviously, it's going to be a love or hate thing. When people say, oh, Gary Oldman is so hammy, he's so over the top, he just overdoes it, I guarantee they're probably thinking about Stansfield. I mean, I know he's got a lot of very shouty parts, I guess, very, very showy parts for sure. But I imagine this is one of the very first ones that comes to mind when you think about Gary Oldman just going for it, just not, which he does, like, 9 times out of 10. He will amp it up to 100, and that's on a scale of to 10. And so, and I could see where it'd be like, you could be a bit dismissive, not just him being over the top, but whenever I watch this, and I watch Stansfield, at least in the early scenes, not so much when he's, like, really losing it later, but in the early scenes, it's very Hans Gruber vibes. To where, like I said, he's got that sophistication where he talks about, like, you know, Beethoven and all that, and all this kind of, we get this kind of classical vibe from him. He's worried about his suits, and I'm just waiting for him to tell me about who he read about in Time magazine. But the thing here is that this character is he could do one of two things, one of many things in the scenes, but like to break it down to two, his involvement with kids. There are scenes in this movie where he murders children in cold blood. That's what sets the whole movie off. Then there's another scene later when he runs into kids and he steals their basketball. He takes it, he gets in his car, and he drives off with it. And it's like, this is just that kind of character that can do any one of these two things without even really a plan. Just on the fly, any of these things could happen with him. He takes those unidentifiable pills that make him make that weird sound and throw his head back. Just really, like it's like he's amping himself up for the performance while he's on camera. That's what it comes off like. What's really funny about this is that he's also one of those characters, I've talked about this a few times, this kind of performance to where it's like, whenever people think of Gary Oldman and his villain roles, this is usually one of the very first, villain roles in general, he seems to be brought up a lot. Not just the whole everyone thing being so popular now out of context, let alone in context, but, yeah, he just really makes his presence known to where when you think about this movie, he's probably one of the absolute first things you think about. Which is weird because he's not in it very much, if you really think about it. Like, this version, which I imagine is the version most people have seen, the international version, is 2 hours and 13 minutes. His screen time has gotta be 15 minutes. I mean, maybe I'm undershooting it a little bit, but it's really does not feel like that much when you go back and watch it. But he just really makes his presence known. He's like one of the first things you think about when you think about the movie, and one of the most talked about aspects of it. I learned this very recently. Stansfield has something that none of the other characters in this movie have that I find very interesting. And I don't know how many. I imagine there's some, but I can't imagine there are many for this in regards to characters that are strictly from original movies and nothing else, like Stansfield. Stansfield has his own Wikipedia page. Like I said, at least in this movie, none of the other characters have that, but Stansfield has his own, where they talk about Oldman's reviews, they talk about, like, a history, all of his tics, how he's considered one of the greatest villains in movie history, just that whole thing. He's got little stats under his picture. It's crazy how much he's such a presence in this movie, and has been ever since, with not a gargantuan amount of screen time. So, that in itself says something. And then, also going on that, is in regards to the villains of the movie, it's also just kind of interesting in general to see, especially when you see the standoff and you see, like, the police shields, and it just, like, occurs to you, it's so interesting to watch a movie, especially nowadays, where it's like, the villains are cops, but they're, like, completely non-complex villains. They're just completely straightforward villains, and they're also cops. And it's not a message movie about police brutality or anything like that. It just so happens that the army of cops is the antagonist in this situation. Once again, I suppose if we were to see a movie from some of the cops' perspective, not Stansfield's for sure, but if we saw the perspective of somebody else, maybe Leon can be considered a villain of sorts, given his job and all that. But, I mean, given seeing the movie from his perspective, it's very easy, regardless of his job, to see him as a protagonist. Especially with his little code of conduct, and I don't know that we ever see him kill a good person. So, I mean, obviously, you get what I mean. In this fictional movie, I can say something like that. So, because it's all fiction. So, now, going on that, I will say that there are moments where I'm not sure. I feel like they could have used their time a little more, especially since they have 2 hours and 13 minutes worth. Which, by the way, the movie does not feel that long at all. Like, I can't even imagine now. I can't even remember if I've seen the hour and 50-minute version or not, but it's like, 24 minutes missing out of it. And it's like, I don't know, because this version just moves so quickly. I can't even remotely remember what would be missing, but I do think they could have used their time a little more, like when, like the whole relationship between him and Matilda, well done as it is, feels really fast. Like, it feels like it happens really quickly. Though, I mean, I suppose there's the really great moment that starts it off. Obviously, they meet up in the hallway a couple of times, but there's that one particular moment where it all changes, where the movie's going to go and take both of them in an entirely different direction, and he thought to make that this moment that really works and really shows a transition from one side of the movie to the other. And that is when probably one of the best, most intense scenes of the movie, when she's, once again, so incredibly smart to just walk by the crime scene and not even look in that direction and go right to his door and just prays that he will answer it. And we have to wait. There's just that waiting period, and then finally, when he opens the door, the camera doesn't show it. We just see the light from through his door hit her. And it's like this, we see the wave of relief hit her, but it's also like, almost like this other sort of beyond kind of pulling her in, and pulling her into this other world, almost literally. So that's probably my favorite moment in the movie, where we actually, like, visibly see her, like, walk into a different life through this light. And yes, once again, though, the way it's able to make that shift to where these characters are coming from such different directions and seem to be going in opposite directions, it seems like if it wasn't put together well, there'd be a lot of jumbled kind of mess going on here. We have all these different kind of principles and directions and all that, but they so carefully kind of make it to where she's got him going in one direction, he's got her going in another, and it somehow just makes them really work well off each other. And like I said, we've got some really great, intense scenes for this crime thriller. It just happens to have this really kind of moving story between the two of them. It actually is able to bring sentiment into it without making it seem like it brings down anything else in the movie, and yet somehow still manages to fit in. Like, it doesn't feel out of place at all. We can cut from her doing her Charlie Chaplin thing, and then in another scene, children are being murdered. But it's like, or the end, this just giant action climax, and it's like, you never feel like you're watching different movies. It all just kind of somehow fluidly works together in a way that's kind of hard to explain, that he was able to pull off with his direction. And just make these characters fit in so well. And I think that's also, once again, just a really big credit to Portman being able to find the balance between her character being a child and also bloodthirsty. That's kind of the middle here, to where these two things have something in common, and she's really a large basis for how this whole movie ends up working. So, like, not enough possible credit can be given to her. Like I said, this is somebody doing their first movie. I mean, you can't even believe it when you say it. But, with that said, yeah, I completely and totally get it if this movie leaves a bad taste with some people, for sure. Because there is the whole thing about Besson's intentions and what exactly kind of story he was telling through his eyes. Because, yeah, when you watch it, you think, oh, yeah, she's being a little weird towards him, the advance. It's kind of like the scene in Orphan when Isabel Fuhrman gets all, adulted up for Peter Sarsgaard. And it's like, even though what that movie reveals, it's like, that's still just a really weird scene. It's basically like a movie devoted to that. And you think, well, yeah, that's a weird direction. But then there's the whole personal aspect that's I don't even know if it's, like, really that much in the public attention, and people were just like, oh yeah, whatever, it's weird. And yeah, it doesn't, I mean, it gives the movie a bit of a weird vibe, but everything else I just mentioned kind of puts it together and makes a very solid crime movie. But I mean, if you know Basan's personal life, I talked about, when we talked about The Fifth Element, Mywin, I think is her name, I'm not positive that's how you pronounce it, but she played the diva in The Fifth Element, and they were married, in a relationship for sure, they have a child and all that, and they started dating, they met when she was 12 years old, Matilda's age, and they started dating when she was 15. And he is like a full-on adult at this point. He's in his 30s, I believe, at this point. And she was 15, and they were dating, and ultimately married, I believe. So, clearly, you can see that, you could say, well, yeah, Matilda sees it as being romanticized, but Leon doesn't. And so that's just the story. But I mean, when you know that the perspective of the writer-director was coming from that in his own life, and Maya may have even come out at one point and said specifically she was the inspiration for Matilda. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, it does kind of make you, it kind of makes you side-eye the movie a little bit, particularly those scenes, and those where it's like her, Natalie Portman being the age that she is, some of her outfits throughout the movie don't leave much to the imagination, which might totally rub people the wrong way. So I guess it just really depends on how you take that. In regards to it totally changing your outlook on the movie, or maybe the movie's good enough that it doesn't. But that's there. But yeah, for the most part, I was always under the impression that it was strictly Matilda that romanticized the whole thing. But when you know that, I guess you can't really be... I don't know. It's a weird thing. But as a whole, like, in the long run, how I feel about the movie is everything I said prior to this point. How it's a great, solid crime movie. Like, some people consider it one of the best ever made, just as they consider Stansfield one of the best villains of all time. And yeah, I don't necessarily, you know, bring anybody down for saying that. I could totally buy that, but I do think it's very good. Certainly, it's probably Bessan's best movie. I do like La Femme Nikita pretty well. Also, going on La Femme Nikita, the music by Eric Serra is also worth pointing out. He did that song during the end credits of La Femme Nikita, The Dark Side of Time, which I believe ended up being the trailer song for Leon. And then the very next year, he went on to also do the score for GoldenEye. And it's like, that's when you know it's like so obvious, because Leon's score and GoldenEye's score are like so similar. Like, they have the exact same sounds in them. So that's worth noting next time you watch GoldenEye. And so, yes, that's very mixed thoughts on that. So, going on to Hanna. What Joe writes on a very interesting path, because he's got, especially when you look at it in the long run too, and not just up to Hanna, because you had, he did Pride and Prejudice, obviously, then he did Atonement, obviously, and then he came on to this, keeping Saoirse Ronan, and going on to this, and then, like, after that, was Anna Karenina, and then Darkest Hour. Maybe I missed one or two in there, but these seem to be the main ones. You'll notice when you look at it as a whole, Hanna sticks out a little bit, which I'm a little surprised he hasn't tried to go into this territory more often, because given the kind of director that he is, and knowing that action was by no means his area of expertise, it came out in a very interesting way, especially since it becomes very clear very early on that this was kind of his way of making a fairy tale kind of movie. And he kind of keeps up that theme throughout, even though in the thing about the whole, I believe he said something where it's like, usually when you think, the typical phrase is fairy tale ending. And when you hear fairy tale ending, you think, like Disney. You think, you know, Cinderella meets Prince Charming, they live happily ever after, all that stuff. But it's like when you go back and you actually look at the fairy tales from their original source, most of those are really dark and don't have those endings. So it's like he wanted to kind of take fairy tale ending in its real sense and add it to this fairy tale of sorts and kind of give it this dark kind of underlying thing throughout, or maybe not so underlying. Um, and it was, and I mean, obviously they hardly have much of any, if anything, in common, but it was worth noting that I think some people kind of looked at this as like, oh, this feels really familiar, because Hanna was a year, I think almost exactly a year, I think they both came out in April, a year after Kick-Ass. So it was like, oh, so Hanna is just Hit Girl, the movie, basically. She's even trained by her dad in this case. And so it's like, yeah, maybe going in you might think that, but like pretty much, once the movie's about a half hour in, I think that'll pretty quickly, you'll find a distinguished difference between the two, for sure. And so we do see her stranded with just her dad in these really nice snowy landscapes. I love my fucking snowy landscapes in movies, I always do. And worth noting, real quick, to correct something that I said in a review a couple of weeks or so back, talking about awards again, when I talked about Phantom Thread, we were talking about Vicky Krieps, who plays Day-Lewis's muse/wife in that movie. And I said, I don't think I've ever seen her in anything before. Well, yeah, those little flashes we see of Hannah's mom and or Banna's wife, there she is. There. So she did do something prior to Phantom Thread. In fact, 6 years prior to Phantom Thread that most people had seen. So there's that. We mostly just see her in like stills though. So it continues on, and yeah, there is, the action scenes are actually quite well done for a director who had done the stuff that Joe Wright had done up to this point. But there are some cases where it kind of feels like he's attempting to, like there was a bit of a lack of confidence, at least at the start, that he could pull off something like that. So there are, even though there are scenes that are certainly well done, like the opening fight with Banna and all that, there's the really great dock scene, the merry-go-round scene with Banna and Tom Hollander that Blanchett ends up showing up in. Some really good action in this, and chases. But then there's scenes like Hannah's escape, where it's kind of like when she kills the woman and Blanchett's watching all this take place, and she runs through the hallways and all that, and it turns like into a music video. Then that almost seems like somebody kind of trying to overcompensate for, I'm not really quite sure how to do the action in this scene, so I'm just going to make it frenetic as fuck and hope that it works out. And so that scene kind of sticks out, especially given the way the rest of the action plays out. What really probably would have really worked for this movie. The flashiness does work okay, and I do understand he's kind of tending to go for more of a, that whole fairy tale thing kind of takes over, and he does the whole, we won't, much like I was talking about with Bassan, we won't worry about realism. We'll just let things happen because they look cool, or because they sound cool, or whatever. As long as they kind of progress things and aren't too ridiculous, they'll work within this story. But then there is, I had a point there, and then I just totally lost it while I was explaining that. But the thing here is that, yeah, it does feel like we do. Oh yes, I knew where I was going with that. Sorry. I was going to say that maybe it would work if the action scenes and the fights in this were more like the fight scenes that we would see a year later in Haywire. To where it almost feels like there's not a lot of cutting, there's like no music, and it's just people kind of beating the shit out of each other, but it's in a very kind of sloppy, real way. I know that would have probably, like I said, taken away from the whole let's abandon realism thing they went for, but I could totally have seen it working here, maybe a little better than the kind of, like I said, the more frenetic approach that we ended up getting, but overall it does work inside the movie. Like I said, especially from a director that's not exactly experienced in that area. And talking about that, while we've brought it up, let me talk about how much I do appreciate that. I do love when, I mean, obviously it's always a nice little novelty, and give the movies a certain little nice touch if they do go for certain instances of realism. But we've gotten like so wrapped up in that, and people become so obsessed and like nitpick what's realistic and what isn't. It's nice to see a movie that just says, fuck that. It's fantasy. It's a movie. There's a reason it's called movie magic, because we can make happen whatever the fuck we want. And so this movie does that, and I love that. One of the first times they do that is the opening scene, or introduction to Eric Bana, where they pull the Good and the Bad and the Ugly thing. I think it's one of the Leone Westerns. I'm pretty sure it's Good, the Bad, and the Ugly one we have. I think it was Eli Wallach. There's the scene at the end when they're at the graves, and even though it's like vast desert and there is just nothing within miles, somehow a character is able to just sneak and pop up from out of nowhere. And Bana does that in this opening scene, but instead of desert, obviously, it's all that snow, and then suddenly Bana's just behind her. And stuff like that, I just really appreciate. Especially if it's intentional. So, and you've got your stuff like when she escapes out of the hole and the car drives over, and she's just gone. And it's like, it's just a cool moment for her. It shows that she's got that Jason Bourne quality where she can just disappear like that and move from place to place. It's like, yeah, she probably would have just had her entire back scraped off, maybe lost her head or something. But no, she can just disappear like that and travel like that. So I do really appreciate that approach, and it definitely goes along with the whole kind of fairy tale vibe. It's like you don't expect realism in fairy tales, so don't expect it in Hanna either, because that's totally what Wright was going for. So, and obviously also going on that, I believe he once referred to Blanchett as a Wicked Witch of the West type in regards to this story, which perfectly makes sense. There is, one of the things I noticed about that, once I really started to think about it, was how much focus there is throughout the movie with Blanchett and her shoes. Like, the compartment in her wall and shit is behind her shoe rack, and then there's the moment where Hannah's watching her under the bed, and it's like, yeah, it's totally there. I'm really getting a Ruby Slipper vibe here. So, and we do kind of see her in some interesting moments. Like, the first time we see her, she's like getting out of bed, she's like brushing her teeth, and it's like she's just going to work, like she works in an office or something. But she just happens to be this CIA-based whatever it is. All we know is that she really wants these people dead, and that's what she's going to do. But you would think, oh, we see her getting out of bed, we see her brushing her teeth and all that, and we think, oh, so they're going to humanize her. No. There's no humanizing this woman whatsoever, and for good reason. That's not like a flaw in the writing or anything like that. She's just got to be this very kind of stone-faced, like, Wicked Witch style antagonist, to where there's no, like, oh, we get to understand her through her motives or something like that. It's no, this character works solely through accomplishing her objective, no matter what that means, and that's it. That's all we need this character to be, and an actress like Cate Blanchett will do that just fine. And still able to bring her kind of elegance to it, but also this very kind of dangerous vibe to her. It all works very well. So Blanchett's easily one of my favorite parts of this movie, for sure. And like the scene I was talking about where she's like reacting to seeing Hanna kill for the first time is just really good. But then we have stuff like once she finds who is Olivia Williams and Jason Fleming, speaking of Kick-Ass, it's I don't know. I still like the movie, I do, but I feel like once it goes in a certain direction, it kind of it stays there too long. Like, it's once she meets this family, this is basically the movie until like the last 20 minutes or so. And I feel like that's kind of a misstep and kind of not a total deliver on the promise that we get on the other sides of the movie, the beginning and the end. So, and it's like, they do this, I mean, yeah, the fish out of water thing is an interesting approach, because obviously she's been isolated, she's clearly the farthest thing from a normal person of her age, she's like a killing machine, she has encyclopedia knowledge, And so just to see her interact with like another girl, I could totally see that being a totally interesting thing. And they do show off those interesting things a lot of the time with comedy. But like I said, my problem is that this is such a large portion of the movie. If it was like, if this movie was more like an Odyssey, where she continuously met different various kinds of characters, I think we'd really have something interesting here, and maybe one or two more action scenes in there. I know it's kind of it may make it kind of seem less, make it more like a kind of run-of-the-mill action movie if they put more action than there already is in it. But I don't know, I just feel like this whole middle, just, there's just something missing. And it's like, maybe put more focus on Banna's background. Put Banna in it more. He kind of disappears for most of this. Maybe give us a little more Blanche. Don't, like I said, don't go into her background or anything like that. But give her kind of more of those interesting, just maybe just standalone scene kind of moments, where she's not necessarily just advancing the plot, but just kind of let her be her villainy self, maybe in one or two scenes. I like the addition of the Tom Hollander character, where he's got his like his tracksuit and he does the whistling, the devil's in the details thing. Where it's like, that's, bring in more characters like him, where he just seems like this kind of odd addition, and it kind of ends up turning it into a bit of a chase movie throughout it, which is another thing where I feel like the movie kind of could have benefited if it felt more like an Odyssey/chase movie or something. Like I said, once she finds this family, it's like it just kind of stops for a long time, and isn't really, seem to be really using its story to its fullest. You know, put more of that crazy random shit in it, like her brushing her teeth till they bleed, or the scene where they tease a Banna Blanchett fight. Like, we're going to see that, and then it just kind of, we don't see it, and whatever it was ends abruptly. And so it does feel, but once again, it's like, when you see it, when you know it's through the eyes of a director like Joe Wright, that's kind of one of those things where it's like, I guess you kind of have to know what you're in for, and it's like, even though he does prove that he can direct an action scene competently, you are going to get a movie that's not quite what you might think it is, given the setup. Where it might not be quite as action-oriented as you're led to believe. There might be a bit of an artsiness to it in this middle portion. Yeah, that's really where I think it kind of falls short. Like, it's one of those movies where I really did love it when it came out, and I loved it when I saw it a second time. But nowadays, it's like, I'm overtaken by that feeling that something's missing. But I think the reason that I was always so high on it when I first saw it was that they really bring it back with that ending, with this chase sequence with Blanchett. And that final scene, to where it's like, I remember the very first time I saw it in theaters, the opening scene, when she shoots the deer, and she says, "I just missed your heart," and then she shoots it and it says the title. I honestly, when that happened, when I first saw it, I like rolled my eyes and I was like, oh, this is one of those movies that thinks it's so badass and so hardcore and so unrelenting. Yeah. And then the second I realized that the whole reason for that opening was that it is also the last shot, and instead of a deer, it's Blanchett, I was like, that is one of the best bookends ever. And it's like, oh my god, that makes so much sense. That is perfect. That could not have been a more perfect last shot. And I love just the way the title explodes on the screen in the exact same way both times, with that red background. Just absolutely perfect. So that, leaving on that high could be a reason I thought I liked it more than I did the first couple of times. But yeah, I vaguely mentioned the devil's in the details, but yeah, obviously one of the things, I remember this vividly, one of the most talked about things when this movie came out was that Chemical Brothers score, which is such an interesting addition to a movie like this. And so cool and so unique, and just really fits the movie in an unexpected way. So that's really great. So I do think Hanna has a lot of strengths. But I think, you know, in regards to similar movies, Leon takes this pretty easily. regardless of its undertones or not so undertones. But like I said, the way it's able to combine the different genres and the tones is just unreal. And like I said, all the central performances are so memorable, and what Portman does is just out of this world incredible. And like I said, really holds the movie together in a big way. And if we had more child performances that were of this caliber, maybe not the same thing, but of this caliber, some that show off this many emotions and can hold a movie so well in place, just, yeah, we'd have a whole bunch of promise. Like, as I've said, the child actors seem to be we seem to be on a much better streak of them than we were at one time, but rarely do you see something this insanely good from such a young actress or actor, so yes, so I think that's going to do it for this one. Next week, like I said, I'll be reviewing a couple of movies from the 1940s, one of which is a Best Picture winner that's going to go out on Oscar Sunday, as per tradition. And then I think we're doing that, we might very well be doing that Oscar video when he puts this up, I don't know, the predictions for the winners. And then next week is like Death Wish and Red Sparrow and probably a couple of other things, so all of that to look forward to for the rest of this month, and then that eventually will go into our Bond retrospective and all that fun stuff, so look out for that. So until then,